This is the second half of Unit 2.1. This is Theme 2, the Age of Jackson, Native American Displacement and Nullification. And just for good measure, we're going to throw in Oregon. But let's start with the displacement of Native Americans. This literally means that the Native Americans, as the white Americans moved westward, were pushed away, pushed out. And if we look here, all of this green territory was the areas where Native Americans typically controlled during 1790, which is when the Constitution was ratified. And by 1860, which is after Jackson and his Indian policy, this is the territory that Native Americans would have had access to 30 years after Jackson. So again, the white settlers have opened up most of the Louisiana Purchase territory and the West Coast. Now, what was the official policy of Jackson? Well, until Jackson, there was no official policy towards Native Americans. Each president sort of did what they wanted to ad hoc. For example, Washington chose to provide treaties to Native Americans. Jackson made a formal policy of removing Native Americans to the West to make more opportunities for whites. He made it seem, if you look here, that he was sort of being fatherly, that he was providing access to different territories. And there's some interesting history here that we don't really get into with these standards. What were the Native American reactions to this westward movement? There's really two general categories. There's resistance, and then there's assimilation. The resistance movement is best characterized by the Seminoles in Florida. They fought for years, literally fighting the Seminole War, trying to keep Americans out of their territory. And really what it amounted to was a slow 20-year forced relocation to Oklahoma. The Cherokee in Georgia, however, tried to assimilate, which means they tried to act similar to the white Americans. In fact, most of them became farmers, and a good deal of them became plantation owners, and a good deal of those were slave owners. So the Cherokee were acting like white plantation owners. But the problem is Georgia felt that they were not the right people to be owning the plantations. And they wanted to get rid of the Cherokee so that white settlers could take over that Cherokee land. The Cherokee sued Georgia and even won the Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court said they should be able to keep their land. But Jackson decided to disregard the ruling, essentially telling the Supreme Court that I'm the president, I have the military, what are you going to do about it? And the Cherokee are going to be forced off of that land, and they're forced to relocate to Oklahoma, which at the time was the most godforsaken territory in the country. The Trail of Tears is how we refer to this. This forced march of Native Americans from the southeast to Oklahoma. The Trail of Tears because Native Americans, many died on this forced march. We have the Seminoles down here, the Cherokee in Georgia, the Choctaw and the Chickasaw here in Mississippi, all forced to move on to a large reservation in Oklahoma. Other impacts did impact the forced relocation, other impacts of the forced relocation. Well, the Native Americans were displaced, but it opened up the new western lands for white settlement. In the South, this meant that plantation owners were going to be moving into that territory, and they were going to be buying more slaves, and they were going to be attempting to implement more slave production. For the slaves, this meant that the slave owners were going to break up their families, and they were going to break up the communities that had been pretty well established on the East Coast as they took their property out west. If you look at this map, the darker the color is the more slaves in the population. The dark orange color is actually 50% of the population or more is slave. Notice here in South Carolina, because of the rice plantations and the indigo, eventually the cotton production. This is the slave population in 1820, so there's probably cotton at this point. By 1860, notice where all the slave populations are moving to the west, even out here into Texas by 1860. Which takes us to the nullification crisis. The nullification crisis is based on sectional differences. The slave issue is characteristic of the economic differences that were plaguing the North and the South. The issue of extending slavery into the West, it's going to lead to conflicts over states' rights versus federal power, and it's going to lead to a sectional crisis that's actually going to lead to the Civil War. The Civil War is foreshadowed in this 1830s nullification crisis. It's based on something referred to as the Tariff of Abominations. And from the Northern perspective, this tariff of abominations was a great thing. They didn't call it a tariff of abomination. Remember that in the North, they were industrial. They wanted a high tariff because that was a tax on imports. This would protect those Northern industries against foreign products. The Northerners also liked it for a sneaky reason. Because if you are increasing the price of foreign products, Americans are going to buy the cheaper product. So they could actually raise the price, the Northerners could raise the price of their product and still be cheaper than the foreign competition, which means that tariffs tended to raise the prices overall, not just the prices on foreign products, which is one of the reasons the Southerners didn't like it at all. The Southerners produced cash crops. They didn't produce anything on their own. They didn't manufacture anything. So they had to purchase all of their items from either the North, which was artificially inflating its prices, or from other countries, which was being charged a tariff. So the Southerners were arguing that all the tariff did was drive prices up on them. They were also worried that other countries might tax their crops, the Southern crops, when the Southerners tried to sell it in places like England, as retribution for this high tariff being placed on British goods or foreign goods. In the West, the Westerners would tend to support the North. It's a political move. It's very calculated because the Westerners wanted to get cheap land, which the Northerners could produce, and internal improvements, which would help out the North and the West. So they supported the Northern tariff because they wanted to get these two things in return. Southerners in the Southwest, less so, but even they needed to have some internal improvements. The South was beginning to see a conspiracy develop. And we can start to see, again, the foreshadowing of the Civil War here. The South saw a conspiracy between the North, and this is a typo, this should say West, to deny them political power and by proxy cause them to lose their way of life. If the Southerners figured if the North and the West were ganging up on them, the South was going to be outvoted in Congress. And therefore, the North and the West would eventually take away slavery from the South, and then all those plantation elites, which were the politicians, would lose their way of life. And they'd have to figure out some other way to make money, and they didn't want to do that. More on this later. Let's get to the actual nullification crisis. The crisis is actually organized or orchestrated by South Carolina's own John C. Calhoun. He was the vice president under Andrew Jackson. He resigned over a few different things, mostly this crisis. He went back to South Carolina and attempted to use a states' rights argument to declare the tariff as null and void, essentially saying that states could override a federal law. Andrew Jackson, for his part, he was kind of sympathetic with some of these arguments, but he's the president of the United States. Jackson is charged with upholding the Constitution, and he is a man of honor, and he believed that if he allowed a state to nullify an act of Congress, this would weaken the federal government. If the South is going to be able to nullify a tariff, what's going to happen when some other state wants to nullify another act of the federal government? And then we're right back to the Articles of Confederation, where the states aren't paying any taxes and the country falls apart. Right? This nullification crisis is an implied act of secession, according to Andrew Jackson's point of view. And it also indicates to him that the states were acting in a treasonous manner. And according to the Constitution, treason can be punished with death. So he is willing to use force to force the Southerners to accept this tariff. And Jackson upholds the tariff. He immediately ordered naval ships to go to Charleston. This is not a small threat, especially from the former general. He pushes something referred to as the force bill through Congress, which literally means he is allowed to use force to collect the tariff. Ultimately, it's compromise that allows him to keep the Union together. He agrees to lower the tariff if the Southerners release the nullification. They rescind the nullification argument. But you can see here the damage is done. They were seeing Andrew Jackson as attempting to be a king and stomping on the Constitution. So the immediate threat is averted. The Union stayed together. However, the Southern states never backed off this claim that they had the right to nullify a federal law. Remember, it has its roots going all the way back to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions with the Alien and Sedition Act and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. But you also need to remember that the federal government never accepted the Virginia-Kentucky Resolution, and it never accepted this argument of nullification. Because if you remember, Marbury versus Madison had set this precedent of judicial review, which is essentially the Supreme Court being able to nullify acts of Congress, nullifying laws. So Marbury versus Madison established that the federal government, not the states, can override an unconstitutional act. When you combine this idea of nullification with slavery and the states' rights argument, this is what leads to the Civil War. You can argue that it was states' rights, you can argue that it is slavery, but they're essentially the same, two sides of the same coin. You can't have the Civil War without states' rights, but you can't have states' rights unless they're arguing about slavery. Now the last piece here, we're going to throw Oregon into this theme because it is in this indicator. The United States had claimed Oregon, and it claims Oregon based on the Lewis and Clark expedition. When Jefferson sent off the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804, this is the path that they took to get to Oregon. This is the Oregon Territory up here. Britain also claimed Oregon. Excuse me. Lewis and Clark established this claim in their journey to the Pacific. Technically, it wasn't part of the United States yet because it wasn't part of the Louisiana Purchase, but Americans still started moving there. They moved into this territory because of its rich farmland and because of its plentiful fur trade. Like I said, Oregon is also occupied by the British. This is all of the Oregon Territory here. It's jointly occupied until the 1840s. Not many people lived there. The United States negotiates a treaty for the modern boundary, which is right about here in the 1840s, because they didn't want to fight with Britain. Britain's still a very powerful military, and the United States had better things to do. Instead of fighting over a bunch of trees and fur up here, they're going to fight Mexico for the Mexican cession, which is the entire southwest corner of the United States. So when we wrap up the West, and this idea of a peculiar institution, I love that, by the way. The peculiar institution is one of the nice ways to say slavery when they didn't want to say slavery. As the population moved west, Southerners sought to extend slavery, while the Northerners wanted free soil. Again, remember, free soil is an economic argument. They just didn't want slaves next to them, those white settlers. They were okay with slavery as long as it stayed away from them. Abolitionists, on the other hand, wanted to get rid of slavery entirely. It was a moral imperative to get rid of it because it was just morally wrong. So Westerners from the South wanted to extend slavery. Free soilers and abolitionists from the North wanted to limit slavery. It is this tension that's ultimately going to lead to the Civil War. It is a states' rights issue, but only when you view states' rights through the lens of this peculiar institution.